Do you ever wonder how students learned before Wikipedia, before the internet, before even the printing press? What if the secrets to truly mastering knowledge were locked away in the dusty halls of medieval monasteries and universities? Number 10. Memorization and oral repetition. The world of medieval learning was in many ways a world of echoes. Before printed books were commonplace, before every scholar could own a personal library of bound volumes, the human voice and the human mind were the primary storage devices for vast quantities of knowledge. Students in a medieval school or monastic cloister did not simply read a text once and then expect to understand it. They engaged with it in a much more intimate physical way, a way that involved the entire body and the very air around them. Practice of memorization through oral repetition was not just a method. It was the very bedrock of intellectual life. It was a discipline that demanded unwavering focus and a deep, sustained engagement with the material, unlike anything a student might encounter today with quick searches and digital summaries. A young novice, perhaps no older than 12 or 13 years, entering a monastery like the renowned Abbey of Cluny or the scholarly house of St. Gall, would begin his studies not with a quill and parchment, but with his voice and his ears. He would be given a passage from a sacred text, perhaps a psalm or a portion of the Gospels, and instructed to learn it by heart. This learning process was not a silent, internal affair. It was loud, sometimes even boisterous, in its collective murmur. The novice might walk the cloisters, his lips moving silently at first, then whispering, then speaking the words aloud over and over again. He might chant the lines, allowing the rhythm and melody to embed the words in his memory, much like a catchy tune gets stuck in one's head today. This was not a passive act of remembering. It was an active vocal performance that transformed the abstract words on a page into a living, breathing part of the student's inner world. The purpose of this constant oral repetition went beyond mere recall. For the medieval scholar, true understanding was inextricably linked with the ability to recite and perform the text. When a master posed a question during a lesson, a student was expected not just to give an answer, but often to quote verbatim from the authoritative texts that supported his argument. This required not just understanding the ideas, but possessing the very words of the masters and the scriptures within one's own mental library. Brother Anselm, a famed teacher at the Cathedral School of Notre Dame in the late 11th century, was known to quiz his students daily on long passages from the works of St. Augustine, expecting flawless recitation. Failure to recall the precise wording was seen as a failure of diligent study and a lack of respect for the wisdom contained within the ancient writings. This method was particularly evident in the study of rhetoric and logic, which were central to the medieval university curriculum. Students aspiring to become lawyers, theologians, or administrators had to master the art of debate and persuasive speech. To do this, they memorized not only the principles of logic, but also countless examples of arguments, figures of speech, and rhetorical flourishes from classical authors like Cicero and Quintilian. A student preparing for a public disputation, a formal academic debate that was a cornerstone of university life, would spend days and nights committing to memory every possible angle of argument, every potential counter-argument, and every relevant quotation that might bolster his position. The very structure of the disputation, with its formalized challenges and responses, demanded an immediate recall of complex information. There was no time to consult a book. The knowledge had to be at the tip of the tongue, ready to be deployed. In the monastic tradition, the practice of lectio divina, or divine reading, also heavily relied on oral repetition. A monk would read a passage from the Bible, then meditate upon it, and finally, often with eyes closed, repeat it aloud, allowing the words to sink deep into his spirit. This was not just about intellectual understanding. It was about spiritual transformation. The words were seen as living and active, and speaking them aloud was a way of internalizing their truth. quiet murmur of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of monks chanting or repeating verses in a monastic church or cloister would have been a common and profound sound, a testament to the collective pursuit of knowledge and piety through the spoken word. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided monastic life throughout Europe, subtly encouraged this method by prescribing frequent readings and communal recitation of psalms. The very design of medieval books also encouraged this kind of memorization. Manuscripts were incredibly expensive to produce, often written on vellum made from animal skins, and each one was a unique work of art and labor. They were not designed for quick skimming. Rather, they were meant to be read slowly, carefully, and repeatedly. A scholar might own only a handful of books in his lifetime, and each one would be treasured and studied intensely. Marginalia. Notes scribbled in the margins by previous readers often included mnemonic devices, diagrams or abbreviated summaries designed to aid in the memorization process, showing that the physical act of learning extended beyond just the main text. These marks served as silent guides, helping a subsequent reader to find patterns and connections that made the complex information more readily recallable. The master's role in this system was also crucial. He would often read a passage aloud to his students, then expound upon it, breaking it down into smaller, more digestible units. The students would then be expected to repeat these units, perhaps even writing them down as dictation before committing them to memory. This process ensured accuracy and reinforced the authoritative interpretation of the text. Errors in recitation were not tolerated. They reflected not just a lapse in memory, but a failure to fully grasp the material. The master, through his own flawless recitation and explanation, modeled the ideal for his students, showing them that true mastery involved an almost perfect command of the authoritative texts. This habit of constant oral repetition and deep memorization trained the medieval mind in a way that is profoundly different from modern learning. It cultivated an internal library, a vast repository of knowledge that could be accessed instantly without external aids. It fostered a deep respect for the exact wording of authoritative texts and instilled a discipline of the mind that prioritized precision and recall. Created a learning environment where the air was filled with the sounds of active study, a living testament to the ongoing pursuit of knowledge through the power of the spoken word and the disciplined memory. Number 9. Scribal copying. In a world without printing presses, every book was a handwritten bucket, a testament to immense human labor and dedication. This meant that the act of copying texts, the meticulous work of the scribe, was not merely a mechanical task, but a profound method of learning. For a medieval student, especially one in a monastic scriptorium or a nascent university, becoming a scribe was often an integral part of their education, a way to internalize knowledge through the very act of its transmission. It was a discipline that demanded patience, precision, and an almost sacred reverence for the written word. This process was slow, deliberate, and deeply engaging, a stark contrast to the effortless reproduction of information in the contemporary world. Imagine a young monk, let us call him Brother Gregory, hunched over a sturdy wooden desk in the hushed warmth of the scriptorium at, for example, the Abbey of Monte Cassino. Sunlight filtered through narrow, high windows, illuminated the vellum page before him. His tools were simple: a sharpened quill, a small knife for scraping errors, a pot of lamp-black ink, and a ruling stick. Before him lay the exemplar, the master copy of the text he was tasked with reproducing. This might be a philosophical treatise by Aristotle, a medical text by Galen, or a theological commentary by St. Jerome. The very act of setting up his workpace, preparing the vellum by smoothing it and ruling lines for the text, was part of the ritual, a preparation of the mind for the focused work ahead. Brother Gregory did not simply glance at the words and transfer them. He had to read each word, understand its meaning, and then carefully form each letter, stroke by stroke, precisely mirroring the exemplar. This process required intense concentration. Each letter had to be perfect, each word correctly spelled, each line straight. A single misplaced dot or a forgotten abbreviation could alter the meaning of an entire sentence or even a complex argument. The physical act of writing, the muscle memory of forming the letters, became a pathway for the information to embed itself in his mind. As he wrote the arguments of a philosopher, he was, in essence, reenacting the philosopher's thought process, solidifying the concepts in his own understanding. The words flowed from the exemplar, through his eyes and mind, down his arm and out through the tip of his quill, onto the new page. The errors of a previous scribe, known as scribal errors, were a constant hazard, and a good copyist needed to be vigilant. This meant not just copying mechanically, but actively engaging with the text's meaning. If a passage seemed nonsensical, the scribe might pause, reread, and sometimes even consult another copy if available, a form of active textual criticism long before the modern era. This constant scrutiny of the text fostered a deeper analytical engagement than simply passive reading. Chronicler Bede, in his famous Ecclesiastical History of the English People, indirectly highlights the importance of accurate copying when he expresses concern about the transmission of texts. Beyond the main body of the text, scribes often added marginalia, notes or glosses. These were not always original thoughts, but often copies of commentaries from earlier scholars or explanations of difficult terms. The very act of copying these explanatory notes further deepened the scribe's understanding. He was not just replicating words, he was replicating layers of interpretation and knowledge. Some scribes even developed personal shorthand or symbols in their margins to remind themselves of particularly important passages, demonstrating a personalized engagement with the material that went beyond mere transcription. Process of illumination, adding decorative letters, borders, and miniature paintings to the text, was another layer of this learning by copying. While specialized illuminators often handled the artwork, many scribes also possessed rudimentary artistic skills. Even if they did not paint, they left spaces for the illuminators, which required understanding the structure and flow of the text. The visual elements were not just pretty pictures. They often served as mnemonic devices, aiding memory and conveying complex theological or philosophical concepts in symbolic form. Careful placement of these images, often at significant points in the text, meant the scribe was continually thinking about the text's organization and its key themes. The physical environment of the scriptorium itself reinforced this method of learning. It was a place of quiet concentration, often chilly and sometimes poorly lit, demanding stamina and discipline. The rhythmic scratch of quills on vellum would have been the dominant sound, a constant reminder of the slow, painstaking work. Hours stretched into days, days into weeks, as a single manuscript slowly took shape. A full Bible could take years to complete, a testament to the immense value placed on each word within its pages. The sheer commitment of time and effort ensured that the scribe, having spent so long with the text, would have absorbed a significant portion of its content, perhaps even without conscious effort to memorize it. The knowledge was embedded through sheer exposure and physical interaction. Scribal copying was also a communal activity, even if the actual writing was solitary. In larger scriptoria, tasks might be divided. One scribe would copy the main text, another would add rubrics, headings in red ink, another would illuminate, and yet another might proofread. The proofreader's role in particular was crucial. This person would read the new copy against the exemplar, often aloud, catching errors. This collaborator, checking, further reinforced the correct transmission of knowledge and trained multiple individuals in deep textual analysis. Young apprentices would learn by observing master scribes, mimicking their hand movements, and gradually taking on more complex texts. This direct apprenticeship meant that the knowledge of textual production, and by extension the knowledge within the texts, was passed down through generations. The enduring legacy of medieval scribal copying is not just the beautiful manuscripts that survive today, but the way this habit shaped intellectual development. It instilled a profound respect for textual accuracy, a deep familiarity with foundational works, and a disciplined approach to learning that prioritized thoroughness and sustained engagement over speed. It demonstrated that knowledge was not just something to be consumed, but something to be actively produced and carefully transmitted, a living legacy passed from one dedicated hand to the next. Number 8. Disputation and debate. Imagine a packed hall in the University of Paris, perhaps at the Faculty of Arts, filled with eager, sometimes rowdy students and esteemed masters. The air hums with anticipation, not for a lecture, but for a public intellectual battle. This was the disputation, the cornerstone of medieval university education, a habit of learning that honed the mind like a sharp blade. It was not just an academic exercise, it was a performance, the public display of intellectual prowess, and a rigorous method for dissecting complex arguments. Far from today's quiet study, medieval scholars learned by challenging and being challenged, by articulating their thoughts aloud and defending them against formidable opposition. The disputation, often occurring weekly or even daily, was a formal, structured debate on a specific question, known as a quaestio. These questions could range from the profound theological, "Can God make a stone so heavy he cannot lift it?" to the intricate philosophical, "Does a hair have a shadow?" The process was highly ritualized, designed to rigorously test logical reasoning, rhetorical skill, and a deep knowledge of authoritative texts. It was a brutal intellectual sport, but one that was considered essential for true understanding. Students did not just sit and listen. They were expected to participate, first by offering their own opinions, and then, as they advanced, by formally defending or attacking positions. The heart of the disputation was the respondent or defender, usually an advanced student or a bachelor, who would put forward a thesis, an answer to the quaestio, and then systematically defend it against all objections. The opponent, or objector, who might be another student, a master, or even a visiting scholar, would then raise objections. These objections were not random thoughts. They were carefully crafted arguments, often citing contradictions in authoritative texts, or pointing out flaws in the defender's logic. The defender had to respond immediately, either by refuting the objection, by showing how the text cited was misinterpreted, or by making a subtle distinction that resolved the apparent contradiction. There was no time for hesitation or for looking up an answer. The knowledge had to be immediately accessible, a testament to the hours of memorization and reading. The role of the master was paramount. He acted as the moderator, the final arbiter of truth, and often the most challenging objector. After the students had exhausted their arguments, the master would step in, sometimes raising even more difficult objections, and then finally offer his own definitive determination or resolution to the quaestio, summarizing the arguments and giving the authoritative answer. This final determination was often what students would diligently copy into their notebooks, forming the basis of their understanding of complex topics. The master's wisdom was not just in knowing the answers, but in guiding the intellectual combat and demonstrating the correct path of logical reasoning. St. Thomas Aquinas, a towering intellectual figure of the 13th century, engaged in countless disputations throughout his career, refining his philosophical and theological arguments through rigorous public debate. His famous Summa Theologica is structured as a series of quaestiones, reflecting the very method of medieval disputation. Preparing for a disputation was an arduous process. Students would spend weeks studying the quaestio from every angle, poring over commentaries, identifying potential objections, and formulating their own counter-arguments. They would read widely across theology, philosophy, law, and medicine, seeking out precedents and supporting evidence in the works of Aristotle, Plato, the Church Fathers, and Roman jurists. This extensive preparation ensured that when the debate began, all participants were deeply immersed in the topic, forcing them to synthesize vast amounts of information and apply it on the spot. It was a form of intellectual triage, forcing rapid assessment and deployment of knowledge. The disputation also fostered critical thinking in a way that passive learning could not. Students were trained not just to absorb information, but to analyze it, to find its weaknesses, and to defend its strengths. They learned to identify logical fallacies, to make fine distinctions, and to argue persuasively. Pressure of public performance also sharpened their rhetorical skills. They learned to speak clearly, concisely, and with conviction, using appropriate language and tone. This was vital training for careers in the church law or royal administration, where the ability to articulate complex ideas and persuade others was essential. The ability to dispute was a hallmark of an educated person. Furthermore, disputations were open to the public, drawing in not just students and masters, but sometimes members of the wider community. This public aspect added to the pressure and excitement, turning intellectual inquiry into a spectacle. The reputation of a master or a student could be made or broken in the heat of a particularly challenging debate. This public scrutiny meant that both the defender and the opponents had to be exceptionally well prepared and articulate, knowing their every word would be judged. It was a rigorous test of intellectual fortitude and persuasive communication, pushing students beyond mere recitation to true intellectual engagement. The habit of disputation transformed learning from a solitary pursuit into a dynamic, interactive, and often confrontational experience. It ensured that knowledge was not simply accumulated, but actively tested, refined, and deepened through the clash of opposing ideas. It trained students to think on their feet, to defend their positions under pressure, and to engage critically with complex arguments. For the medieval scholar, the ability to engage in a vigorous disputation was the ultimate proof of intellectual mastery, a testament to a mind sharpened by constant challenge and refined by the fire of public debate. Number 7. Meditation and contemplation. Lectio Divina. In the medieval world, especially within the serene walls of a monastery, study was not always an active pursuit of new facts or a boisterous public debate. Often it was a quiet, deep, and reflective journey into the heart of a text, a practice known as lectio divina, or divine reading. This habit was less about acquiring new information and more about internalizing and transforming existing knowledge, particularly sacred texts, into personal wisdom. It was a slow, deliberate engagement that blended intellectual understanding with spiritual contemplation, a method for truly absorbing material rather than just skimming it. This was a form of deep work, long before the term existed, a continuous immersion that led to profound understanding and lasting memory. Practice of lectio divina was not a single linear process, but rather a four-stage journey, each stage building upon the last. It began with lectio, the reading itself, but this was not a quick scan. A monk or scholar would read a passage, typically from the Bible, very slowly, often aloud or in a murmur, savoring each word, much as one might taste fine wine. The words were not just symbols on a page. They were a direct message, a living utterance. The reader would pause at words or phrases that resonated, allowing them to sink in. This initial reading was about attentive reception, opening the mind and heart to the text without immediate analysis or judgment. It was a patient unfolding of meaning, letting the text speak to the reader. The second stage was meditatio, meditation. After reading, the student would stop and ruminate on the words, chewing on them, turning them over in the mind, much like a cow chews its cud. This was a personal internal dialogue with the text. What did these words mean for me? How did they connect to other parts of my knowledge or experience? This was not about intellectual analysis in the modern sense, but a more intuitive, reflective engagement. The scholar might repeat phrases, visualize scenes, or ponder the implications of the text for moral conduct or spiritual insight. It was a process of internalizing the text, making it a part of one's own thought process, allowing the ideas to penetrate beyond the surface. 12th century Carthusian monk Guido II, in his influential treatise, The Ladder of Monks, meticulously described these 4 steps, emphasizing the iterative and personal nature of this contemplative reading. He saw it as a ladder leading to a deeper connection with truth. Following meditation came oratio, prayer. This was the natural outpouring of the heart and mind in response to the text. If the text revealed the truth about God, the response might be adoration. If it revealed a flaw in oneself, it might be repentance. If it inspired a desire for action, it might be a petition for strength. Text ceased to be an object of study and became a catalyst for a personal conversation, a living exchange. This stage underscored the medieval belief that true knowledge was not merely intellectual accumulation, but something that transformed the individual from within. The knowledge gained through the text was not just for intellectual show, it was for the shaping of the soul. The final stage was contemplatio, contemplation. This was a gift, a moment of profound insight or profound peace, where the mind rested in the presence of the truth, revealed by the text. It was a moment of wordless understanding, a deep communion that transcended mere intellectual concepts. It was not something that could be forced, but rather a culmination of the disciplined reading, meditation, and prayer. In this stage, the text dissolved, leaving behind a pure apprehension of its essence. This was considered the highest form of understanding, a true integration of knowledge into one's being. This multi-stage process of lectio divina was not limited to monks. While most systematically practiced in monasteries, its principles permeated other forms of study. Students of philosophy and theology at universities also engaged in deep repeated readings of their foundational texts, Aristotle, Plato, the Church Fathers. They would read, ponder, discuss, and allow the ideas to marinate in their minds. The goal was not just to recite arguments, but to truly comprehend the underlying principles and integrate them into a coherent worldview. Quiet study carrels in libraries and monastic cells were designed to facilitate this deep individual engagement with texts, providing a sanctuary for concentrated reflection. The flickering light of a candle illuminating a single page, the silence broken only by the turning of a vellum leaf or a whispered word of repetition, defined the environment for this profound learning method. The habit of meditation and contemplation also had practical benefits for memorization. By repeatedly engaging with the text on multiple levels, reading, chewing on its meaning, responding to it, and finally resting in its truth, the material became deeply ingrained. It was not a superficial memory of facts, but a profound understanding of concepts. Text became a part of the student's internal landscape, readily accessible and profoundly understood. A scholar who had spent years in this deep engagement with the text would possess a profound mastery that went far beyond mere intellectual recall. He would not just know what the text said, but why it said it and what it meant for existence itself. This medieval habit reminds us that true learning sometimes requires slowing down, stepping away from the rush of information, and allowing the knowledge to truly permeate one's mind and spirit. It teaches the value of patient engagement, reflective thought, and the integration of intellectual understanding with personal meaning. For the medieval scholar, knowledge was not a commodity to be consumed quickly, but a profound wellspring to be drawn from slowly, thoughtfully, and with an open heart. Number 6. The Shola, or study group. While we often picture medieval scholars as solitary figures hunched over ancient texts in dimly lit cells, a significant portion of learning happened in lively, collaborative settings. The shola, or study group, was a foundational element of medieval education, from the informal gatherings of students in a university town to the structured lessons within a monastic school. This habit of communal learning fostered intellectual exchange, provided mutual support, and deepened understanding through shared inquiry. It demonstrated that knowledge was not just individually acquired, but often collectively constructed, a vibrant ecosystem where ideas flourished through interaction. This collaborative approach stands in contrast to solely individual study, highlighting the power of peer learning and discussion. In the bustling medieval university towns like Bologna, Oxford, or Paris, students often came from diverse backgrounds, spoke different dialects, and sometimes even different languages. Forming a shola, a small informal gathering of fellow students, became an essential survival strategy. These groups provided a supportive network, a place where students could review lectures, discuss difficult concepts, and prepare for rigorous disputations together. A student who missed a lecture, for example, might rely on notes taken by a diligent member of his shola. They would meet in rented rooms in the corner of a noisy tavern, or even outdoors in a quiet courtyard, their voices murmuring as they dissected complex arguments and practiced their Latin. Within these informal scholae, peer teaching was a common practice. A student who had a stronger grasp of logic might explain intricate syllogisms to his less adept companions. Another, skilled in grammar, might help correct the Latin compositions of his friends. This act of explaining, articulating concepts aloud served to solidify the teacher's own understanding while clarifying the material for the learners. As the Roman philosopher Seneca the Younger famously wrote in his moral letters to Lucilius, "While we teach, we learn." This sentiment was deeply ingrained in the medieval collaborative spirit. Records from the University of Paris in the 13th century frequently mention student groups hiring a more senior student, known as a cursor, or reader, to review texts or dictations with them outside of formal lecture hours, a clear precursor to modern study groups. Formal, scholastic settings, like cathedral schools and monastic institutions, also utilized a form of shola. Young novices and junior monks would often study together under the guidance of a master or an older, more experienced monk. In these settings, the emphasis was on communal recitation, shared interpretation of sacred texts, and cultivate transcription of manuscripts. During the daily monastic readings, for example, if a passage proved difficult, it would be discussed collectively with different monks offering their interpretations, guided by the abbot or prior. This collective inquiry ensured that the entire community progressed in their understanding together. Collaborative aspect of copying texts in a scriptorium also involved a form of shola. While the act of writing was solitary, the larger process often involved multiple individuals working on different parts of the same manuscript, or proofreading each other's work. A master scribe might oversee a team of junior scribes, offering guidance and correction. This shared endeavor not only ensured accuracy, but also allowed knowledge about textual production, manuscript illumination, and even the content of the texts themselves to be passed down and refined through collective effort. The physical act of sharing materials, space, and the burden of transcription fostered a strong sense of intellectual community. Beyond academic subjects, the concept of a shola extended to practical learning through guilds. Apprentices learning a trade such as masonry, weaving, or goldsmithing would work closely with journeymen and masters. While this was a master-apprentice model, the apprentices often formed their own informal groups, sharing tips, practicing techniques, and helping each other master difficult skills outside of the master's direct supervision. They learned not just from the master, but from each other in a true collaborative setting. The informal network of apprentices and journeymen in a city allowed for a broader dissemination of practical knowledge and innovation. The disputation itself, though often framed as an individual battle of wits, was also a deeply collaborative endeavor. Students would often prepare for a disputation as a team, brainstorming objections, anticipating counter-arguments, and refining their rhetorical strategies. The respondent, while alone on the stand, would have had the support of his shola behind him, cheering him on and perhaps even subtly signaling support or reminding him of a point. Collective preparation for these intellectual contests highlighted the communal aspect of learning, where individual performance was often the result of shared effort. The habit of studying in a shola fostered not only intellectual growth, but also important social and personal skills. Students learned to articulate their thoughts clearly, to listen critically, to respectfully disagree, and to build arguments collectively. They developed a sense of intellectual camaraderie, forming bonds that often lasted a lifetime. For the medieval student, learning was rarely a purely solitary pursuit. It was a journey often undertaken with companions, where shared inquiry and mutual support were as vital as individual intellect. The shola was a living testament to the belief that the pursuit of knowledge is enriched and deepened when undertaken in community. Number 5. Learning by apprenticeship and observation. In the medieval world, much of the knowledge that built towns, crafted goods, and sustained daily life was not learned from books or lectures, but through direct hands-on experience, guided by a master. The system of apprenticeship, deeply embedded within the guild structure, was a powerful habit of learning by doing and observing. It was a holistic education that combined practical skills with theoretical understanding. Passed down through generations of skilled artisans, this method of learning, rooted in direct mentorship and constant exposure, allowed for the transmission of complex, often tacit, knowledge that could never be fully captured in a written text. It emphasized the importance of embodied knowledge, where understanding came through the hands as much as through the mind. A young boy, perhaps as young as 7 or 8, might be apprenticed to a master craftsman, a baker, a carpenter, a blacksmith, a tailor, or a painter. This was not just a job, it was a formal agreement, often for 7 years, during which the apprentice lived with the master's family, becoming part of the household. His education began with observation. He would watch the master at work, noting every precise movement, every subtle technique. He would see how the master prepared materials, how he handled his tools, how he problem-solved when faced with a challenge. This initial phase was about absorbing the craft through immersion, allowing the actions of the master to form a mental blueprint in the apprentice's mind. The apprentice learned the rhythms of the workshop, the smell of the materials, the sounds of the tools, becoming intimately familiar with his future trade, long before he was allowed to perform complex tasks. As the apprenticeship progressed, the boy would be given increasingly complex tasks. He might start with simple chores, fetching water, cleaning the workshop, preparing clay for the potter, or sharpening tools for the blacksmith. These seemingly mundane tasks were foundational. They taught discipline, attention to detail, and familiarized him with the raw materials and tools of the trade. Slowly, he would progress to more skilled work, initially under the master's direct supervision. The master would demonstrate a particular technique, then watch as the apprentice attempted to replicate it, offering immediate feedback and correction. This iterative process of demonstration, practice, and correction was central to the learning. A goldsmith's apprentice, for example, might spend months perfecting the delicate art of hammering gold leaf without tearing it, a skill that required incredible patience and a sensitive touch. The learning was not just about the physical manipulation of tools and materials. It also involved understanding the principles behind the craft. A master mason would teach his apprentice about the properties of different stones, the principles of arch construction, and the mathematics of building stability. A master dyer would explain the chemistry of natural dyes, how different mordants affected color, and the best time of year to harvest certain plants. This theoretical knowledge was rarely abstract. It was directly linked to the practical application. It was learned through direct explanation from the master, through observation of the outcomes of different choices, and through the apprentice's own trial and error. The Guild Statutes of London in the 14th century, for example, meticulously detailed the responsibilities of masters to teach their apprentices all the secrets of the trade. The apprentice also learned about the business and social aspects of the trade. He would observe how the master interacted with customers, how he managed his finances, how he sourced materials, and how he upheld the reputation of his guild. He learned about quality control, fair pricing, and the ethical conduct expected of a craftsman. This holistic education ensured that the apprentice not only mastered the technical skills, but also understood the broader context in which his craft existed. It was a complete training, preparing him not just to be a worker, but to eventually become a master himself. Running his own workshop, the learning environment was one of constant feedback. The master was a direct, omnipresent teacher, correcting mistakes as they happened, praising good work, and setting expectations. There were no formal exams in the modern sense. Instead, the apprentice's progress was assessed daily through his work. Eventually, to become a journeyman and then a master, the apprentice had to produce a masterpiece, a complex work demonstrating his complete mastery of the trade. This final project was judged by other masters of the guild, a rigorous and practical assessment of his accumulated knowledge and skill. The observation extended beyond the master. Apprentices would observe journeymen, older apprentices, and even other masters in different workshops if the opportunity arose. They learned from the collective wisdom of the craft community, absorbing best practices and innovations through direct exposure. This living transmission of knowledge, passed from one generation to the next through embodied practice, ensured the continuity and evolution of complex skills. It was a dynamic hands-on pedagogy that valued practical competence as much as theoretical understanding. For the medieval learner, knowing how to do something achieved through years of diligent observation and practice was often as important, if not more important, than merely knowing about something. Number 4. The role of the tutor and master. In the intricate tapestry of medieval education, the figure of the tutor or master stood as a beacon of knowledge and authority, the central pillar around which all learning revolved. This was not a passive role of simply delivering information, but an active, deeply personal mentorship that shaped the student's intellect, character, and spiritual life. The habit of learning under a direct, authoritative master was fundamental, fostering not only the transmission of complex knowledge, but also the development of a disciplined mind and a rigorous approach to inquiry. It was an apprenticeship of the mind, where the student absorbed wisdom not just from what the master said, but from how the masters thought, acted, and lived. At universities, like the one in Bologna or Salamanca, students, often called scholars, would enroll under a particular master. This master was not just a lecturer. He was an interpreter of texts, a guide through complex arguments, and a living embodiment of the intellectual tradition. He would give lectures, but these were not merely presentations. The word lecture comes from the Latin lectura, meaning reading. The master would literally read aloud from an authoritative text, and perhaps a commentary on Roman law by Accursius, or a medical treatise by Avicenna, stopping frequently to expound upon difficult passages. Students would diligently copy these explanations, forming their own personal textbooks. The master's authoritative interpretation was crucial, guiding students through the vast and often contradictory body of ancient and contemporary knowledge. Beyond the formal lectures, the master was the primary figure in disputations. He would set the quaestio, guide the debate, challenge the students, and ultimately deliver the definitive determination. This was a moment of profound learning. The master, through his own intellectual prowess and his ability to synthesize complex arguments, demonstrated the very act of critical thinking and reasoned discourse. Students learned by observing his method, his logical precision, and his mastery of rhetorical skill. The master was not just teaching facts. He was teaching how to think, how to argue, and how to arrive at truth. Saint Albert the Great, the teacher of Saint Thomas Aquinas, was renowned for his profound intellectual breadth and his ability to engage in disputations across a wide range of subjects, serving as a powerful model for his students. In monastic schools, the role of the master was even more pervasive. The Magister Scholarum, or master of the schools, was responsible for the entire intellectual and spiritual formation of the novices. He would teach them grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, and the sacred texts. His lessons were often one-on-one or in very small groups, allowing for highly individualized instruction. The master would not just impart knowledge, he would oversee the novice's moral development, ensure his adherence to the monastic rule, and guide his spiritual exercises. This holistic mentorship meant that the master was intimately familiar with each student's strengths, weaknesses, and learning style, tailoring his approach to maximize their growth. For example, a Benedictine abbot like Saint Benedict himself, as outlined in his rule, was responsible for the teaching and spiritual guidance of his monks, a truly comprehensive form of mastership. The master was also the gatekeeper of knowledge. Access to rare or precious manuscripts, for instance, was often controlled by the master or the librarian he oversaw. He decided which texts students would study and in what order. This control ensured a structured progression of learning, guiding students from foundational concepts to more advanced theories. He would also recommend specific readings and sometimes even lend his own personal copies of texts to promising students, a gesture of great trust and encouragement in an age where books were incredibly valuable. The relationship between student and master was one of deep respect and obedience. Students were expected to defer to the master's authority, to diligently follow his instructions, and to learn from his wisdom. This hierarchical structure was seen as essential for effective learning. The master, in turn, had a profound responsibility for the intellectual and moral well-being of his students. He was not just an instructor. He was a surrogate parent, a spiritual guide, and a mentor whose influence often extended throughout the student's entire career. Many famous medieval scholars maintained lifelong correspondence and relationships with their former masters, a testament to the profound impact of this bond. This habit of learning under a direct master meant that education was highly personal and deeply immersive. It was not an anonymous experience of receiving information from a distant authority. Instead, it was a dynamic, interactive process where the student was constantly guided, challenged, and shaped by the direct wisdom and example of an experienced scholar. For the medieval learner, the master was the living bridge to the vast accumulated knowledge of the past, and the guide who illuminated the path to intellectual mastery. Number 3. Physical environment for study. The pursuit of knowledge in the medieval period was profoundly shaped by the physical spaces in which it occurred. Unlike the sprawling campuses and varied study spots of today, medieval learning was often confined to specific purpose-built environments that inherently encouraged deep concentration, order, and a sense of reverence for intellectual work. The habit of immersing oneself in these carefully designed spaces, such as monastic cells, scriptoria, and university carrels, was not just a logistical necessity, but an integral part of the learning process itself, fostering discipline, quiet reflection, and sustained engagement with demanding texts. These environments were designed to minimize distractions and maximize mental focus, creating an atmosphere conducive to profound intellectual absorption. The monastic cell, for instance, was a common study space for individual monks and scholars. Often a small, Spartan room, it provided a sanctuary from the world's clamor. Within its stone walls, perhaps lit only by the narrow beam of sunlight through a window or the flickering glow of a beeswax candle, a monk would spend hours in lectio divina prayer and study. The solitude of the cell was not a punishment, but a deliberate choice, an environment where the mind could focus entirely on the sacred texts or philosophical arguments without interruption. The limited space, often just enough for a bed, a stool, and a simple desk, forced a minist approach to study, emphasizing mental focus over physical comfort. The very austerity of the cell was believed to aid in intellectual and spiritual clarity, stripping away worldly distractions to allow for a deeper engagement with knowledge. The scriptorium, often a large, well-lit hall within a monastery or cathedral, was a dedicated workspace for communal scribal, copying, and illumination. While the monks worked individually at their carrels, small, often cubicle-like wooden desks designed for solitary work, the scriptorium fostered a collective atmosphere of quiet industry. The only sounds would be the rhythmic scratch of quills on parchment, the rustle of turning pages, and the occasional soft murmur of a monk repeating a passage to aid memorization. The design of the carrels, often facing away from each other or tucked into window alcoves, provided a degree of privacy while still being part of a larger shared intellectual enterprise. The ample windows, often facing north to provide consistent glare-free light, underscored the critical importance of illumination for the meticulous work of copying. The scriptorium was a place of focused, sustained effort, where the sheer physical labor of producing books instilled a deep reverence for the written word and the knowledge it contained. University libraries and lecture halls also had their own distinctive atmospheres. Early university libraries were often organized to facilitate deep study. Books were not typically loaned out, but chained to desks, ensuring their security and availability for scholars who came to consult them. This chaining meant that study was often conducted at the book, rather than taking the book away. Scholars would spend hours at these chained desks, poring over heavy tomes, taking notes and engaging in silent, sustained reading. The very act of visiting the library and physically interacting with these precious books reinforced the value and seriousness of academic pursuit. The air in these libraries would have been thick with the scent of old parchment and dust, a tangible reminder of the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Lecture halls, though more communal and often less quiet than a scriptorium, were also designed to facilitate learning. Students would sit on benches or straw-strewn floors, often copying down the master's dictation verbatim. The focus was entirely on the master's voice and the authoritative text he was interpreting. The physical proximity to the master and to fellow students fostered a sense of collective learning, even if the primary mode was passive reception of information. Later, during disputations, these halls transformed into arenas for intellectual combat, where the physical layout allowed for clear visibility of the debaters and an attentive audience. The overall habit of medieval study environments was one of structured discipline. The spaces were often simple, functional, and designed to minimize distraction. There were no comfortable chairs, no distracting art, no external stimuli to pull the mind away from the task at hand. This austerity was intentional, aimed at cultivating a mind that could focus intensely for long periods. The very act of entering these dedicated spaces signaled a shift in mindset, a commitment to the serious work of intellectual or spiritual growth. For the medieval scholar, the physical environment was not just a setting for learning. It was an active participant in shaping the mind and fostering the profound concentration necessary for true mastery. Number 2. Fasting and asceticism. In the medieval worldview, the mind and body were inextricably linked, and for many, especially those pursuing spiritual and intellectual endeavors, mastering one meant mastering the other. The habit of fasting and asceticism was not just a religious practice. It was also considered a potent tool for sharpening the intellect, improving memory, and achieving a deeper understanding of complex truths. This disciplined approach to bodily appetites was believed to purify the mind, making it more receptive to knowledge and more capable of sustained intellectual effort. It was a rigorous method that linked physical sacrifice with mental clarity, a stark contrast to modern approaches that often prioritize physical comfort and constant stimulation. Fasting was a common practice across various medieval social strata, but it held particular significance in monastic life and for scholars. Monks often observed strict dietary rules, abstaining from meat, dairy, and sometimes even wine for extended periods, or reducing their intake of food to bare necessities. The rationale was simple. A body that was well-fed and indulged was thought to be sluggish, prone to distractions, and less able to engage in rigorous mental work. Conversely, a body disciplined through fasting was believed to become more alert, more spiritually sensitive, and more intellectually acute. The idea was to quiet the demands of the flesh, so the spirit and mind could flourish. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most Western monasticism, prescribed moderation in food and drink and regular periods of fasting, seeing them as aids to spiritual and intellectual discipline. Asceticism encompassed a broader range of practices aimed at bodily discipline beyond just food. This could include long hours of standing or kneeling in prayer, wearing simple or uncomfortable clothing, enduring cold or limiting sleep. These self-imposed hardships were not acts of self-punishment, but rather a systematic way of training the will and strengthening mental fortitude. For a scholar, prolonged study at a cold, unheated desk in a monastic cell, perhaps in the pre-dawn hours, was a common experience. The physical discomfort, far from being a hindrance, was seen as a way to focus the mind. If the body was uncomfortable, it would not demand indulgence, leaving the mind free to grapple with the intellectual task at hand. The medieval philosopher and theologian Saint Bonaventure, a prominent Franciscan, was known for his rigorous ascetic practices, which he believed aided his profound theological insights. The connection between physical discipline and mental acuity was deeply rooted in the medieval understanding of human nature. The human being was seen as a microcosm of the universe, with a higher rational soul and a lower corporeal body. Passions and desires of the body were often viewed as potential obstacles to intellectual and spiritual progress. By reining in these desires through ascetic practices, scholars believed they could elevate the rational faculty, making it more capable of discerning truth. This was not a negation of the body, but a deliberate effort to subordinate its lower functions to the higher pursuit of knowledge and wisdom. Beyond the philosophical underpinnings, there were practical consequences. A monk or scholar who was less focused on food, comfort, or material possessions would have more time and energy to dedicate to study. The simplification of daily life, stripped of unnecessary distractions, allowed for a deeper, more sustained engagement with intellectual and spiritual tasks. Fasting, for example, could lead to a heightened sense of awareness, a clarity of thought that some ascetics described as a spiritual high. This mental sharpness was believed to directly benefit memory, analytical reasoning, and contemplative insight. The Desert Fathers, early Christian hermits whose writings were highly influential in the medieval period, often spoke of the clarity of mind achieved through extreme fasting and solitude. The habit of asceticism also fostered resilience and perseverance. The ability to endure physical discomfort for the sake of a higher goal translated directly into the intellectual realm, studying for hours on end, poring over difficult texts, engaging in lengthy disputations. These activities required immense mental stamina. The discipline cultivated through bodily asceticism trained the mind to withstand fatigue and to push through intellectual challenges. It built a mental toughness that was essential for navigating the complex and demanding world of medieval scholarship. While extreme forms of asceticism were primarily associated with monastic life, The underlying principle of discipline and moderation extended to secular scholars as well. The expectation was that serious intellectual work required a certain degree of self-control and detachment from worldly pleasures. For the medieval scholar, learning was not just an intellectual exercise. It was a holistic endeavor that demanded discipline of the entire person, body, and soul. This habit of self-denial was seen not as a burden, but as a path to intellectual freedom and a deeper apprehension of truth. Number 1. Illumination and visual learning. In an age when books were rare and precious, and literacy was not universal, visual elements played an extraordinarily significant role in conveying knowledge. The habit of incorporating and utilizing illumination, the intricate art of decorating manuscripts with vibrant colors, gold leaf, and detailed imagery, was not just about aesthetics. It was a powerful method of visual learning. These visual aids served as mnemonic devices, organizational tools, and direct conveyors of complex information, making texts more accessible, more memorable, and more avid. For the medieval mind, knowledge was often seen as something to be experienced, visually, as well as textually, a fusion of art and wisdom that transformed a simple page into a captivating educational landscape. Consider a medieval manuscript, perhaps a copy of the Gospels, a book of hours, or a scientific treatise on astronomy. The first letter of a chapter, known as an initial, might burst forth from the margin larger than life, adorned with swirling vines, fantastical creatures, or miniature scenes depicting a key event in the text. These illuminated initials were not merely decorative. They were visual cues, drawing the eye to the beginning of a new section, signaling a shift in content. For a reader, particularly one still developing their literacy, these visual markers acted as guideposts, helping them navigate long, dense blocks of text. The imagery often encapsulated the essence of the chapter's content, providing a quick visual summary that could be recalled even if the specific words proved challenging. Beyond initials, full-page, miniatures, and borders populated many manuscripts. These elaborate illustrations depicted biblical narratives, scenes from daily life, symbolic representations of virtues and vices, or even scientific diagrams. For example, a medical text might include detailed drawings of the human body or specific surgical instruments. A bestiary, a popular medieval book describing real and mythical animals, would combine descriptions with vivid illustrations, each animal carrying moral or theological symbolism. These images were not extraneous. They were an integral part of the learning experience, translating abstract concepts into concrete, memorable forms. The famous Tres Riches, Hers du Duc de Berry, a 15th century book of hours, Schenke's stunning full-page illuminations that depict seasonal activities, astrological symbols, and religious events, combining artistic beauty with calendar information and devotional content. The purpose of these visual elements was deeply pedagogical. For a society where many learned through oral transmission and visual storytelling, illuminations bridged the gap between spoken word and written text. They served as powerful mnemonic aids. Complex theological concept, difficult to grasp in words alone, might be represented by a series of allegorical figures or symbolic objects within an illumination. A student, having seen the image, could more easily recall the associated text. The visual narratives provided a framework upon which the verbal information could be hung, making it stick in the memory more effectively. The visual imagery tapped into a different part of the brain, strengthening recall through multisensory engagement. Illuminations also served to organize and structure information. Complex genealogies of kings or saints might be presented as intricate trees, with names branching off visually. Astronomical charts and maps were by their very nature visual representations of complex data, allowing students to understand relationships and spatial concepts that would be difficult to convey through text alone. Diagrams, explaining logical arguments, astronomical orbits, or the hierarchy of angels, were common in scholarly manuscripts, breaking down intricate systems into digestible visual components. A student studying the cosmos, for example, would rely heavily on schematic diagrams illustrating the Ptolemaic system, or the movements of planets absorbing the knowledge through visual patterns. Creation of these illuminated manuscripts was itself a learning process. Scribes and illuminators, often working in monastic scriptoria or professional workshops, meticulously planned each page. The scribe would leave precise spaces for the illuminator, indicating where initials and miniatures should be placed. This required a deep understanding of the text's structure and its key themes. For the illuminator, translating abstract concepts into visual form demanded a profound grasp of the subject matter, whether it was theology, history, or natural philosophy. This collaborative process meant that knowledge was not just copied, but actively interpreted and re-expressed through visual art, deepening the understanding of all involved. The sheer beauty and artistry of illuminated manuscripts also fostered a sense of reverence and wonder for the knowledge they contained. A lavishly illuminated book was a treasure, a work of profound human effort and skill. This intrinsic value, communicated through its visual richness, encouraged a more careful and respectful engagement with the text. It was not just a tool for information. It was an object of contemplation, something to be savored and admired. This aesthetic appeal could itself be a powerful motivator for learning, drawing the eye and the mind deeper into the content. The use of precious materials like gold and silver in illumination further emphasized the extraordinary value of the knowledge being transmitted. The medieval habit of illumination reminds us that learning is not always a purely textual or auditory experience. It can be profoundly visual, leveraging the power of imagery to convey, organize, and embed complex information. For the medieval scholar, the illuminated page was a dynamic interface between words and pictures, transforming abstract knowledge into a captivating and memorable feast for the eyes and the mind.